because when you put a fear of failure into people, then a couple of bad things happen. Number one, people stop thinking for themselves. Now it's just a case of, I'm going to wait for Maurice to tell me what to do because I don't want to fail, because if I fail, bad things are going to happen. I'll be reprimanded publicly. I will maybe lose my job, whatever it may be. So I'm not even going to experiment or try anything, because that can have a very bad experience for me. So I don't do it. So I go into my safe zone. I sometimes call it the nodding head syndrome. Have you ever sat in a big meeting and the boss is talking and everybody's just sitting there nodding their heads? It's not a good thing. So you want to encourage people to try things. Mm-hmm. You want to give them that safety net to be able to fail and learn, and in that learning provide tremendous additional value to the organization or the group going forward, that there's an experience that we learn from.
Hello everyone, a quick heads up. I've been experiencing some connection issues while recording my conversation with Jeremy. It has affected somewhat the video experiences. Apologies for that. Other than that, everything is fine. So please go ahead and enjoy a truly fantastic conversation with Jeremy on highly effective intuitive leadership. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my podcast, The Intuitive Leader. And I am very happy to present to you today Jeremy Swartz. Sometimes you just know 30 minutes is not going to be enough. This is one of those moments, as our next guest has a wealth of experience to share with us. But we're going to do it in 30 minutes, so hang on. By way of introduction, Jeremy carries over 30 years of executive experience with high-tech corporations in the telecom and financial sectors across the globe, including IBM, TIBCO, and ESW Capital. He is also an investor, active in cryptocurrency, and a specialist in mergers and acquisitions. His work has brought him literally all over the world, from Asia to the US, and most of it in between. And currently, he is the CEO of TradeShield, a company using AI in the financial sector, automating the ongoing management of credit limits and balancing risks and profitability to help other businesses grow. Besides South Africa, his company is active in Mexico and the US. He graduated cum laude, that is with the highest honors, on his bachelor's degree in political science and history, and he has also studied leading global businesses at the Harvard Business School. When Jeremy is not out there building companies somewhere in the telecom, tech, or financial sector, he enjoys outdoor living or is sailing on his boat. Currently, he is living in South Africa with his family. Jeremy considers himself to be an intuitive leader, and I promise you a fascinating talk on topics such as intuition, leadership, psychological safety, and the act of failing. Jeremy, such a pleasure to have you on.
Maurice, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. And this is such an interesting moment to speak to you. So let's dive straight into it. According to you, let's get the definition out of the way. What is intuition?
Intuition is really a sum total of instinct, being able to understand energy, being able to make decisions based on experience. And a lot of it, I think, is actually hard to define, Maurice, because some people tend to be more in tune with intuition than others. And so I've seen a definition of intuition that says it's not a rational or something that you can actually practice or get better at. It's almost a native ability to be able to understand an energy flow or a situation or a person without cognitive or rational data. I believe some of that to be true, but I also believe that intuition is something that we're all blessed with. But unfortunately, we don't spend enough time when we're young engaging with that sense and trusting it enough. So I think it's a complex and interesting subject. And from a leadership point of view, we're going to get into some more detail in the course of this morning's chat. But it's a very powerful tool to be used when you're dealing with humans, or especially in complex situations which require sound judgment. So for me, it's a sum total of experience, instinct, and really leaning in to what your senses are telling you. I hope that's a useful definition, but that's my thought on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, it is. It is. You already mentioned a couple of moments there in terms of decisions, relationships, in general, when at work do you, as being the CEO of your company, when do you use intuition? In what circumstances?
All the time, really. I think particularly when there is a complex situation involving competing interests in a room, so whether it's an internal or a customer-facing situation, when you're going into a room or when you're faced with a lot of data. And I think sometimes, in the world that we live in now, we tend to set a very high store on cognitive ability, on emotional intelligence, being able to analyze data. All of that is true. But there's a huge tool at our disposal, which is that native ability to be able to understand things sometimes beyond the numbers and beyond the data. I do think it's very much like a muscle. It's something that you need to lean into, something one needs to practice. And the more you practice, the more you're able to trust that. So to give you an example, if I'm walking into a room, if it's a large presentation, or if I'm giving a presentation or a speech, one example of that is being able to read a room. And we use that expression a lot, read a room. What does it mean? It's really to understand not just what is happening, but why it's happening and what the forces are at play in a particular given situation. And there was a wonderful quote that I read many years ago, which really has been such a watchword for me. It's over 2,000 years ago. Marcus Aurelius, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, spoke about in his book on living and dying and living the good life. He uses a great quote where he says, of all things, understand what is its nature, simplicity, the basics. And for me, that's a huge input with regards to intuition, because sometimes we can be overwhelmed with data. Sometimes the numbers and the information can be quite overwhelming. And really understanding what is this person's core, or what is the situation's core? Where's the flow or the energy going in the situation? And if one takes the time and the trouble to try and understand that a little bit, you move out of what I call reaction. If we're not thinking like using our intuition, we tend to just respond to the surface information, or we feel defensive sometimes, or we don't really listen to what's going on because we just like waiting for a gap so that we can talk, that kind of poor communication behavior. Where what I find with intuition, which is so interesting, is I find it a calming thing. I tend to get excited. I think I have quite a Mediterranean personality, so I use my hands and I like to be emotional. What I found intuition helps me with is to slow down a little bit mentally, to sometimes let a silence be a silence, and to give myself time to process and analyze what my intuition in my tummy is telling me. Whereas if you're not thinking like that, I find I tend to be operating at a very shallow level, just in terms of almost like give and take, boom, boom, question, answer, instead of taking time to understand, where is this coming from? What am I reading here? What should I be thinking about? Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much. And if I summarize it with, it helps you stay strategic, keep the overview.
I think that's a fair point. In my experience, in certainly in my life, my experience is that women tend to be far more strategic than men. And I've seen that in the business world. They tend to be better gatherers of information and being able to process a lot wider spectrum, whereas men, we tend to be more linear, very focused. We're good at that. And neither of these things is good or bad, but I think really getting in touch with that almost female energy, that strategic thinking of allowing your senses to be open to things coming from around you, not just on this narrow vision that we tend to sometimes focus on, is really helpful. So I think that's a good definition, Maurice. Strategic thinking rather than just being locked in the tactical moment. I think that's a good definition of that.
All right. Interesting. And given the fact that you are CEO of your company today, the whole corporate experience that you've had in your life right now, and from a previous talk to you, I believe you mentioned to me that you were almost looking to go and retire, but you couldn't help yourself to jump on the next project here. But with all this luggage you have, all this experience you have, where does your intuition come from? In a sense, like how come you are in touch with your intuition, and what triggered it, or where did that start? Just curious, but the journey behind where you are today?
That's a great question. I think it starts. I'm a very curious person. I've always been very curious. I read voraciously, so I have a very active mind. And I think early on in my career as a manager, when I was a lot younger, I found that oftentimes when there were stressful situations or situations that required calm, rational thoughts that were perhaps emotional or tense, I didn't perform at the level that I would have expected of myself. And so it started really, the journey was a journey of discovery for me. So I started reading. I read some really fantastic books, which informed my view around what great leaders do, and what makes great leadership. And you know, I do want to stress that leadership is not linked, in my view, to a title. You know, I think all of us can be leaders, and we all need to be followers as well. You know, I think all of us report in some way, shape, or form to somebody, and so leadership sometimes can be a bit of a misused word because we link it to a title or having, you know, power or people that report to us, etc. But leadership really is around getting things done, and using the resources, whether those are human resources or other tools, to be able to get things done. So we're all, you know, we can all be leaders. But to answer the question, it started with a journey of discovery. And what I found in my reading and in my studies was that the folks that do really well in corporate life are able to see a big picture, to be able to see the larger forces at play, and to be able to, first of all, understand them, and then understand how to harness them. And I was very fortunate as part of my journey to have a manager that I, to this day, stay in touch with, who's a profoundly deep thinker and a fantastic leader. And I asked him to mentor me just with regards to the way that he would you know, handle some of these situations. So for me, it was a combination of really learning at the hand of a master, and being open to that learning, and the generosity that he extended to me by giving of his time. And it's a journey, you know, Maurice. You don't suddenly, these don't suddenly click into place. But one thing I do want to stress as part of our chat this morning, it doesn't quite link to intuition, but it very much links to leadership, and something I really would like to get out into the world, is concept of paying it forward, of not holding on to knowledge or experience, sharing what you have as a larger energy flow. You know, that example of throwing the pebble into a pond and the ripples spreading out across. And that's one of the things that I have learned deeply in my life, is not to cling on to knowledge or to power, but to make it freely available, be a force for good. So all of us in our various ways have experiences that we've gone through, that we've hopefully learned from, and sharing that with whoever asks or whoever benefits from it, I think is a very healthy thing. And so, you know, when it comes to journeys of discovery, all of us have a path, and I think it behooves all of us, especially as leaders, to freely make ourselves available to share our learnings with one another.
That's fantastic, and it's my observation that you are doing that right now. You are paying it forward, just like you had your mentor. You are now sharing your experience and your expertise. So that's you are doing that, and I'm grateful for that. So that's good news.
That's well put. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, and I think it's there's a humility that comes with that as well. You know, all of us are human. All of us make mistakes. I know a little bit later in our chat we're going to talk a little bit about failure. I'd love to share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can do it now. That's fine. Yeah,
sure. But you know, just the art of engaging with other humans and being able to listen, being able to learn, to be able to share. There's a much larger energy flow that all of us are connected to. And when we don't use intuition, when we are selfish, when we are all about ourselves or all about a very linear, specific goal, for me, those are all things that disqualify us from the bigger picture of what we're doing on the planet. And, you know, I think when you speak to people who are happy and content, there really is a notion of, I think where we find real meaning as human beings is when we give. And in whatever form giving takes, whether it be to other people or to, planting a forest or helping animals or whatever it is. But when we engage in selfless acts, there is tremendous meaning that we find as humans. And so part of this knowledge sharing that I'm talking about for me is a part of that narrative, is to be able to help the larger group, almost from a primitive point of view. How do we help our tribe to be better, to learn, to grow, etc. And failure is part of that. I think you and I had an interesting chat a couple of weeks ago about failure. Maybe we can segue into that a little bit later, but I'll be keen to hear your thoughts on what you've come across with other leaders that you've spoken to. What have you come across with regards to
in terms of failure?
Sure.
Yeah. So none of them have expressed it so well as you did, in the sense that how you talked about failure and the lessons learned from that. So, but I think I've interviewed maybe 30 or so leaders, many of them CEOs, on, let's say, psychological safety, trust, the building of culture in a company. And most of these people that I had on my call, they were very open for these topics. They recognize the importance of creating safety and establishing trust, and by not punishing people. So that seems to be the common thread, at least among those people that I've had. I've had the honor to interview, if you like. But you had a very crisp way of looking at it, sharp. You're very welcome to share it.
Sure. So I think in our culture, failure has a very bad reputation, a bad rap. We think failure is bad and succeeding is good. And in my view, we have a motto that we use in our business, which is we either want to win or we want to learn. So making mistakes or failing, we see as a very negative experience. And my experience is counter to that. I think if one can be humble and learn from the painful things that all of us go through, so we leave behind things like resentment and anger and self-doubt and self-hatred and all these things that can psychologically take place when we don't achieve a goal, or if we quote unquote fail. I think the really key thing for me as a leader is failure for me can be a very positive thing, but making the same mistake twice is not good. So, if we're in a situation where I think oftentimes what you'll find with founders or people that are very engaged in a business from a leadership point of view, there's a lot of micromanagement that can take place because the sense is that I've been here before, I know better. Let me jump in here quickly and stop you from making a mistake. Hold on a second, let me come and fix this, And I've seen this play out many, many times. And one of the difficult things to do as a leader is to allow your people around you to have the same benefit of that experience that you had, which is to fail and not to feel like their job or their reputation or their safety, you used an interesting phrase, psychological safety, is at risk. Because when you put a fear of failure into people, then a couple of bad things happen. Number one, people stop thinking for themselves. Now it's just a case of, I'm going to wait for Maurice to tell me what to do because I don't want to fail, because if I fail, bad things are going to happen. I'll be reprimanded publicly. I will maybe lose my job, whatever it may be. So I'm not even going to experiment or try anything because that can have a very bad experience for me. So I don't do it. So I go into my safe zone. I sometimes call it the nodding head syndrome. Have you ever sat in a big meeting and the boss is talking and everybody's just sitting there nodding their heads? It's not a good thing. So you want to encourage people to try things. Mm-hmm. You want to give them that safety net to be able to fail and learn, and in that learning provide tremendous additional value to the organization or the group going forward, that there's an experience that we learn from. Whereas if we are only in a situation where we prize success, then you'll find that the organization becomes very rigid and stagnates. And so sometimes that very difficult thing is to be able to step back and allow someone the benefit of failing so that they can actually grow and learn, and knowing that you support them, I think is very powerful. And I've seen that work really well.
To me, that sounds like it's building trust, not just trust between, let's say, leadership and everybody else, but also trust within humans, trust within the team or within an employee, to actually dare to take a risk, but also to trust their own judgment or their own decision making. And okay, it went bad the last time, it turned south the last time. I did it in the wrong way maybe, but I've learned from it. I'm now going to do it in a different way. So I'm going to succeed this time, or at least become better at it. That builds trust. You're building up people from the inside. That's how it sounds to me.
You're right. And you know where it starts? It starts in the hiring process. You know, Maurice, you literally want to make sure that when you are in hiring mode, when you are recruiting and looking for candidates for your organization, the key thing for me really is it's about fit. So it's not whether the person is a good person or a bad person, or you think they're great or not great. It's really does this human being that you are engaging with, do you feel that there will be an interchange of good energy or good fit on both sides? You know, oftentimes we think of interviewing as the interviewer sitting on the pedestal and the person below sort of hoping that they're going to get the job. And
begging for the job, yeah.
Yes, exactly. I tend to do interviews very differently. You know, it's really a conversation to understand from both sides, is there value in doing something together, or is this not potentially a good fit? And so when you start with that process, I've spoken about this at conferences, I've written about this, but for me, when I'm hiring, I look for qualities in the human being rather than years of experience or degrees, etc., on a CV. Now, of course, people need to be competent, so you know that has to be the starting block. But things that I look for when I'm engaging with candidates, hiring process for any job, I look for things like positive mental attitude. I look for things like proven hard worker. I look for people who are keen to learn and to grow. I look for examples of unselfishness. And when you look for, in other words, you're hiring for character. And when you surround yourselves with people that share those values, you can teach skills, you can train people that can make mistakes. But if you've got a good human or good humans with solid characteristics like I've outlined, you know, my dad used to call it grit, you know, that ability to be able to keep your head down, work through the tough times, get things done. When you look for examples of that, I'll give you a true life example of when I'm hiring. Something that I find very interesting is I look and see, did this person put themselves through, excuse me, their degree or their initial tertiary education themselves? Did they do, for instance, a correspondence degree? That's a very interesting one for me, because if somebody has gone through the university experience, as an example, and put themselves through long distance learning, that for me is a very strong indicator of desire, of grit, of character, and of hard work, because you know, typically those people are doing a full-time job, they're having to do the degree separately. Typically they've had to finance it themselves. Their parents haven't just put them through university when they're 18 years old. So and this is an example of where data can feed intuition. So these little nuggets that you look for, and you say, this is interesting. You know, Maurice did this and this, and this. He had a newspaper route when he was 10. Interesting. That's hard work, right? That's a little kid getting on his bicycle every day, delivering news. There's a lot of responsibility there. Little things like that for me are very telling, rather than saying, hey, I've got this four-year in degrees from university. And I think when you look for examples of those kinds of characteristics, building an organization becomes a very joyous experience. You know, you mentioned at the beginning of the introduction how I was, this time last year, I was semi-retired, but I find something that's so important in life, you know, Maurice, is to have a love for the work. So sometimes it's not even about the result, but the joy of being in the battle, you know, with the troops, building, growing, scaling, learning, all of that stuff. It starts with love, actually. And if you don't love what you do, if you don't love the people around you and want to do your best for them, it can be a very stressful experience. I find that although there are lots of complex things in my work, I don't ever feel negative stress about it, although I can certainly get tired, but it's not a joyless experience going to work. For me, it's a very joyous thing going to work. And, you know, I'd love to share that thought to whoever listens to this podcast, is find whatever it is for you that you love doing, whatever it is, not what your parents tell you, what you think your friends expect, or what society expects. Find something that really that you enjoy doing on a daily basis. And that is such a secret of life, rather than stuck in a career where you hate your job, you're resentful, stressful. It can lead to all sorts of bad things.
Yeah, you said so many interesting things here in the last 5 or so minutes. There are so many things I want to react on or respond to, or just comment on some one way or the other. In minding of time, I will pick out 2 only. So one of them is that this is actually very funny. I wasn't 10, but I was 14, I believe. I started to work though when I was 11, but in a different way. But when I was 14, I actually did the newspaper thing that you mentioned. It was quite funny. And then you spoke about people finding.
Interesting. I also had a newspaper route when I was a little boy, so that's an interesting thing we've got in common. That's great.
Early up in the morning, right? There were tough mornings sometimes when it was raining. So and people finding that true purpose or true meaning or what I love to do in life. That's where intuition comes in. By the way, I thought that's just a side note. This is the end of part 1. Part 2 is already published, so simply go and scroll down to the next episode. If you can't wait to participate in this conversation, simply go to intuitiveleader.net/podcast, where you can register for our free community, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded leaders. And if you're wondering how you can trust your gut, or how we can train you and your team on intuition and intuitive leadership, please check out my website on intuitiveleader.net/masterclass. And now let's fast forward to part 2 with Jeremy Swartz.